Hello, everyone. Welcome. And thank you for joining us for Motivation and Bias Strategies for Developing Greater Self-Awareness and Observational Skills. We're so excited to have you here today. My name is Lucy, and I will be your host from MRG. And before we begin, I'll just cover a quick bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, so you will get a link to the recording, to the slides, even a blog post with a summary of the key points and some Q&A. So you'll receive all of that after the webinar if there's anything you want to review or share with someone else. And due to the large size of our group today, everyone is on mute, on listen-only mode, and your cameras are off, but we absolutely want to hear from you during the webinar. We're excited to get your questions, of course, any comments you may have. So many of you have probably used Zoom before. You just navigate to that bottom center of your screen to enter questions, and we welcome those at any time. We'll break for questions a couple times during the broadcast, but you're certainly welcome to put those in as they come to you. And we'll get to as many of them as we can today on the broadcast, and then we'll be sure to follow up after if there are any that we're not able to get to. And this webinar is eligible for CE credits from the Society of Human Resource Managers. So do email clientservices@mrg.com for attendance verification if you need that. And I'll give you a brief introduction of who MRG is and who's going to be guiding you through our content today. So MRG is a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. We have solutions for leadership, motivation, personal development, sales, service, and they're insightful, they're research-backed instruments, and they're designed to foster a deep level of self-awareness to help people pursue lasting growth, and we'll certainly be talking about that today. MRG was founded more than 35 years ago, and our assessments have been used by thousands of certified practitioners in more than 100 countries around the globe. And you'll have two presenters today. You'll have Tricia Nadiff and David Ringwood. So if you've been to our webinars before, you've probably heard from them. Tricia is the president of MRG. She's based in our Portland, Maine headquarters. She's been working with individuals, teams, and organizations for more than 30 years in consulting and coaching, product design, research. And she also shares MRG insights around the world. You might have seen her at events like ATD, the Society for Consulting Psychology Conference. She's been a TEDx speaker. And spoken at conferences around the US and around the world. And David Ringwood is based in our Dublin, Ireland office, and he's been with MRG since 2006 as the VP of Client Development for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And you've probably seen David's name as well. He's contributed to Association of Coaching magazine. He's presented at EMCC, the European Mentoring Coaching Council, and published articles with IMD. He also has a very extensive background in consulting and really works with clients in all aspects of our business, teaching, certifications, product development, really just in any way that people are using the assessments in their practice. And he's very passionate about assessment and how it can be used to support people both in their professional worlds and in their life journeys as well. So with that introduction, I will now hand things off to our presenters. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks for kicking us off. Welcome, everybody. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and David's heart. And so we're going to jump right in. And we're going to, just so you know, have a lay of the land where we're going. We're going to start off with some brain basics because there's some good neuroscience insights that help us understand the neurobiology of why we are all biased. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about what bias is and how they develop in our minds and in our perceptions. David's going to take us through the journey of the intersection of motivation and bias. And we won't leave you hanging, right? So great. All this stuff about bias, what do we do to mitigate it? How do we manage it? So we're going to take you through. We have a lot of content, so we're going to jump right in. And if you've been a part of the MRG webinar community for any time at all, you know we like to kick off with a poll to just so that we can understand each other a little bit more as a learning community. So here's the poll question. How frequently are you in discussion or education around bias in the organization you are in or in the organizations you work with? So it can be frequently, you're talking about it all the time. It's certainly been much more active in many of our social environments recently. So maybe it has heightened for you. Somewhat frequently, you're just, you're beginning to work through it a little bit more regularly. You're figuring out as an organization or with your clients how to talk about it. Maybe it's only happening sort of in this almost popcorn way, right? At small little pockets, just occasionally it's showing up. Or maybe it's still a topic that's not really a part of the organizational conversation yet, or your clients aren't really moving into this space yet. So let us know, how frequently is the discussion and or education happening around bias?
Thanks everyone for coming in with those votes. We'll give you just another second or two for anybody to weigh in who hasn't yet.
It's a challenging conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about how to maybe de-escalate the way that we talk about it. So be interesting to see where everybody is.
It is. Interesting split. So we have 20% said frequently, 31% said somewhat frequently and beginning to talk about it a little more regularly. 36% said only occasionally are they discussing bias, and 13% said very rarely or not at all.
Great. Thanks for participating. It's such an interesting topic. It can be very loaded, and David and I and Lucy hope that through our conversation with you today, we will be giving you some tools for both the conversation and also tools how to either with yourself, with your team, or with folks you're coaching, how to work with bias. So let's start with the brain, because that's where bias starts. Many of you know we really love the neuroscience space at MRG. It grounds us in understanding the dynamics of human behavior and human engagement. So we anchor ourselves in a few truths about the brain. The brain has two primary functions. The first one and dominant one is to keep us safe. Not only keep us physically safe, but keep us psychologically safe. So keep us safe. And the second is actually in service of the keep it safe, and that's to conserve energy. The brain structure is built so that it chooses the lowest energy path by default. And the reason it does that is to preserve energy in the brain in case of emergency, right? So these two dynamics, if you understand these two dynamics, then the pathways that the brain travels become a little bit easier to understand. So as a result of wanting to keep us safe, the brain has evolved to be very, very threat sensitive. There's a great social cognitive neuroscientist, Rick Hansen, and he said, you know, we're in a modern world with a very old architecture brain. He said, our brain is built for peak performance in the Stone Age. So our brain in modern life but tends to be more threat sensitive than we need it to be. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a bit. But because the brain is trying to conserve energy, it also tends to be what we would consider a little bit lazy, right? It chooses the path of least resistance. It chooses to go down automatic, habitual, unconscious paths because it takes less energy. And so if we want our higher order thinking to come online, we sort of have to work for it because that consumes a lot of energy in the brain. So let's understand the brain just a little bit more. So the brain is about, 3 pounds of this sort of gray matter inside our skulls. But even though it's relatively small for volume or weight, it uses 20%, about 20% of the energy in our body. So, what we breathe and what we consume, the brain takes up about 20% of that. So it has a function that's been around for a long time. The older part of the brain, you might hear words like amygdala or basal ganglia or limbic system. Those are older parts of the brain, and they are less energy consuming parts of the brain. And they control things like our emotions. You've all probably heard fight, flight, or freeze response. They control our habits. And this is the automatic place where our shortcuts live, the automatic ways of thinking in the brain. There's also a higher order function in the brain, and it's the prefrontal cortex. It's right behind your forehead. And the brain consumes a tremendous amount of energy, but the prefrontal cortex is the gas guzzler of the brain. Of the amount of energy that the brain consumes, 80% of that, roughly 80% of that is used by the prefrontal cortex. So the brain tries to divert activity, thinking, ways of being to other parts of the brain in that sort of lazy automatic space. in order to conserve energy. But this is a very precious part of the brain, right? It's where all the higher reasoning and broader thinking happens, memory, inhibition, and willpower. When we have to plan and organize and actually think through things, flexible or complex decision-making happens here. Interesting empathy and moral conscience happens here. Our thinking about, sort of our ethics lives here. Patience lives here, hope lives here, and metacognition, which is essentially the ability to watch how your mind is working, to watch your own thinking, right? So all of these higher order things are things that are very valuable in a complex world. But if we're in it for too long, if we're engaged in this work for too long, you'll often find yourself, your brain becoming tired. You can't think as well. Many of you may have heard of or even read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a great book. If you haven't had a look at it, it's worth it. He does a very good job of explaining these two thinking patterns. The fast thinking pattern, which is mostly controlled by the older part of the brain, and the slow thinking pattern, which is mostly controlled by the prefrontal cortex. So in that thinking fast part of the brain, it's, that part of your brain that's always scanning, it's always on, it reacts to things very quickly, but not always accurately. It's on without you turning it on. It's just on automatic. And it's where the brain makes shortcuts for us. It's where our impulses are. It's where we call our gut feeling, our quick intuition comes from. And again, as I said, this part of the brain is used a lot, in part because it doesn't require as much energy. Unlike the thinking slow part, again, mostly used in the prefrontal cortex, it is used for that complex thinking, for very specific kinds of issues. It has to be turned on. In other words, you have to be in, it's not on automatically. You have to turn it on with a decision or a problem that you have to solve or something that you have to learn, right? It is slow, but its deliberate thinking is usually more accurate. It is an effortful part of the brain, but it's valuable, again, when we're dealing with complexity or when we have to engage in managing our own behavior. It is important. And again, it consumes a lot of energy. So I want to give you an example of give me an example of this whole shortcut thing. How does that work? So I'm assuming that many of us, maybe most of us, maybe even all of us on this webinar drive, right? And I'm assuming that many of us have been driving for a lot of years. So think about a time where you were driving down a familiar place. Maybe you're driving to work or driving one of your kids to school or driving to the grocery store, a place that you know and go to frequently. Think about a time where you started out of your garage or your driveway, and before you know it, you are at your destination, but you don't remember the journey to the destination. Right? You don't remember the stoplights. You don't remember all the different places that you passed. You don't know if you passed a bicycle, a person walking. So under that, but you got there. You got there safely. So who was driving? Who was driving? It wasn't your prefrontal cortex. It was actually your basal ganglia, that older part of the brain. So that's just an example of you didn't have to think. You didn't have to be very conscious. There was another part of the brain that was actually doing that. So how does this all relate to bias, right? We have this thinking fast and thinking slow and this automatic way where the brain creates these shortcuts where we don't have to be so conscious about what's actually happening. How does that influence what bias is? All right, so the neuroscientists who do some teaching in this like to say, if you have a brain, you're biased. So I'm going to just speak about just a second here, about why bias can be really challenging to talk about, because almost all the people we engage with aspire to a set of values or a set of ideals that say, I have an egalitarian way of thinking, right? I am a thoughtful person. I don't make snap judgments. I'm careful about other human beings. I have a value about not being biased, about not being judgmental. And so when we tell people that they're biased, it flies in the face of an important way of understanding themselves. So what we have to distinguish for people is the difference between having a value associated with bias versus the brain's automatic patterns that yield bias that are separate from our values, right? So our brains are not always working in alignment with our values, and that certainly happens with bias. So we all have this. I think that's one of the things that can open up the conversation. If you have a brain, you're biased. So let's think about this, right? Every second, our brain encounters roughly 11 million pieces of information. And if you're like me, if this is the first time you're seeing this, what, that's crazy. But you have to think that our brain is not just processing all the things in the external world. Our brain is fully responsible for everything that's happening in our body down to the cellular level. And so if you understand the complexity of our biology with the complexity of the outside world and taking in information through the external world, through all of our senses, you start to understand the scope of what the brain encounters. But the brain, in terms of our ability to actually grab that data, it is about 50 pieces of that information. And if you're thinking about what can the brain actually process for us consciously, what we can actually take in in a given second, it's only 7 pieces of information that our brain can consciously process so that we know it's being processed, right? So because there's so much information, the brain has to develop shortcuts, right, to fill in the blanks. It can't deal with all of this information consciously, so it has to build these shortcuts. And this is where the biases comes in, right? Your brain has been building a database since probably before the day you were born. And it is gathering information about people, about things, about places, and it's storing all that data. And so that you can make quick, the brain can make quick judgments for you based on what's in your database, right? So these shortcuts that the brain thinks it's serving up for us in a helpful way, that's what causes us to make unconscious decisions, right? It's all happening automatically and very quickly. Unfortunately, many of these unconscious decisions are wrong. If you think about how much the world has changed, even in the last 2 centuries, never mind the last 10,000 years, and you realize our brains haven't changed much over the last 10,000 years, you realize that again, as I said before, our brain is designed for peak performance in the Stone Age. So it has some trouble in this modern world. And our decisions tend to be more inclined to be wrong, these snap judgments, when the situation is especially complex, like dealing with another person. Right? So the more complex the situation or the individual or the dynamic or my interior world at that particular time, the more likely our judgment is to be off. All right, it gets even more complicated though. So these biases allow us to make snap judgments about people, right? They look like somebody I know, they did something nice to me at one point, they were rude to me, they interrupt me, whatever the dynamic is. We make these snap judgments, and we tend to not only sort of make a decision based on a small piece of data, like one experience or one pattern that we view in the person, but without even realizing it, automatically we extend that decision to their whole character. So they're rude or they're selfish or they're benevolent or they're generous, or we take, our brain takes relatively small pieces of information and likes to create a bigger construct around it. So another part of our brain is, our brain has mechanisms to reinforce our belief system and help us feel more confident about our judgment. And so we also have these mechanisms that sort of make us more confident in the judgment than we would be if we really analyzed it. So as a result, shortcut that leads to a bias, that leads to a label with a mechanism that makes us sure that we're right. right? That's the chain. And everybody has it. And it's all happening unconsciously. It's all happening automatically, right? So if you have a brain, this thing happens, and so you're biased, right? It's just the mechanism that we're dealing with. So let me just give you quickly some examples of this, so that might be a little bit more concrete. So we're, those of you in the United States, we're in a very dynamic political environment, and so we're probably all very aware of confirmation bias, right? Our brain gives us little reward signals when we encounter information that we agree with, and our brain creates discomfort, actually both in the brain and in the body, when we hear things we disagree with. And that is called the Semmelweis reflex. It's the rejection of the thing that we disagree with. Naive realism is a bias that we have the accurate line of sight into what's true. We are well informed, we are thoughtful, we arrived at our point of view after being very considered, and anybody who disagrees with me just isn't as informed, doesn't have a clear line of sight. Again, it's a way of reinforcing confirmation bias and staying away from the Semmelweis reflex. Illusion of truth is really fascinating. Illusion of truth is the more the brain hears something, the more it believes it to be fact. And one of the things that's really important to know about illusion of truth, it believes it whether I hear it from outside of me, right? So I hear it over and over again in a commercial or in statements in my organization, but it also is influenced by my own self-talk. If I repeat things over and over again to myself, I start to forget that it might be an opinion and believe it's a fact. False consensus effect is the bias we have that more people agree with us than actually do. Fundamental attribution error is if John is mean to me, I think that John is just a mean son of a gun. If I am mean to John, I attribute my meanness to circumstances. I'm not a mean person. John provoked me. I didn't sleep well last night. I was irritated. I was having a bad day, right? So we excuse ourselves, we attribute our things to circumstances, and we more likely are attributing other things, particularly negative things, to other people's character. The illusion of transparency is the bias that I believe you understand what's going on inside of me and what my rationale is and what my motivation is more than you do. And it works the other way. I believe that I understand you and your bias and your rationale and your motivation more than I do, right? So it's the illusion that there's more transparency between us. And then finally, we're all very familiar with this, and even more so, I think, recently we have been had the unfortunate need to be reminded of stereotyping and the negative impact that stereotyping has in our society. So these are just examples of what now is almost 200 documented different types of biases that our brains construct with the intention of saving energy and being helpful, but with the shadow side of it often getting us into a little bit of trouble with being inaccurate in our perceptions. All right, so what amplifies bias? Great, right? The speed, how quickly I have to make a decision, complexity, if I am stressed, if I am overloaded by all the things that I have to do. And so you think now in the pandemic, with all the things that's going on, the risk for our brains to go into this automatic space are even greater, right? So we have to even be more watchful. All right, so let's pause and see where we are with questions.
So one actual comment that just came in is that it sounds like there's very little we can do about these biases.
Stay tuned. That's
yeah, it's a very nice tee-up, isn't it? Yeah.
There are things that we can do. It does take discipline. Think about it this way. This part of your brain is always on. And what we have to be able to do is turn on the other part of our brain. And we have to recognize that the automatic part of our brain, when the automatic part of our brain is running the show. And so we're gonna absolutely take you through that. We won't leave you. Oh,
If you're
great, what do
hopeless.
I do?
One other question, Trisha, just is there any evidence that our brains will evolve to handle complexity better and therefore be less reliant on these biases?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, evolution doesn't work at the pace that human life works at, right? So evolution happens over eons. But the good news is, as neuroscience, as a science is growing, where we once thought our brains were, completely one and done and baked by the time we were 20, we now know that we can change the biology of our brain, and that is called neuroplasticity. And so while there isn't a lot of evidence that the brain is actually evolving, there is really good evidence that we can adjust our individual brains. And so there is a mechanism for us, I guess, in a way, to evolve our own brain. It's a great question.
Great. All right, I'll let us keep going, but folks, please do enter those questions, anything clarifying you have, any comments you have, please go ahead and put those in at any time. We'll have one more break, and then of course we'll follow up if we can't get to them during the broadcast. Thanks.
Excellent. I'm going to take over the next section. It's always interesting to hear where these biases originate. They're not random, they occur for specific reasons. And one of the things that we become to recognize as we navigate our own worlds is the uniqueness of people. We can talk about, gender differences and generational differences and cultural differences, and there's legitimacy in that. But the truth is that every person is unique. How's that for diversity? And because every person is unique, it's equally likely that they may have a very unique set of biases attributed to them. And it's not about whether we have biases or not have biases. We can't think too categorically about these things. Which biases may apply to us, we have to reflect upon, we have to self-observe. The extent to which this bias may affect us is an interesting question. And this is where reflection, observation, coaching, all of these types of methods can really play. But one of the methods that we can use is that we can measure to some extent psychometrically. And when we look at the correlation between motivation and bias, it only makes sense to begin with an instrument which focuses specifically on the measurement of motivational characteristics. That is, those factors that provide us with a personal sense of energy and fulfillment and reward. Now, that's not the same as behavior. The fact that we do something doesn't necessarily mean we enjoy it. The fact that we enjoy something doesn't necessarily mean we're doing it. It's not the same thing. So we're talking exclusively here about elements that provide us with that fulfillment, that energize us to a more significant extent. Again, it's a question of degree. And we have a tool called the Individual Directions Inventory that measures 17 such characteristics. It's important to understand some of the nature of motivation, and particularly when we think about it relative to the topic of bias, because these motivational characteristics are not arbitrary. They occur for reasons. They were shaped earlier in our existence. So the first 10 to 12 years are probably particularly important in creating at least an initial shape on these motivational factors. The parental style, the size of the family, the societal and cultural context from which we emerge. All of these and many other variables will craft the motivational characteristics, and they do originate from those places, and some people are very much in tune with them, others less so. But they are important because they go strongly towards potential areas of bias. When people look at it's the IDIs, the Individual Direction Inventory, it's these 17 motivational characteristics. It's easy to recognize our own behavior because it is what we do in fact. And behaviors, as you know, are very tangible, they're very observable. why we do what we do. Some people are very much in tune with that, other people less so. And there's often at least one or two, perhaps three areas where there is a bit of a surprise for the individual, either in the fact that these drivers are there, but more particularly in the extent to which. So it's because it's hard for us to have any objective view. How can any of us understand where we are motivationally compared to others, which is exactly what the instrument measures, when the only thing we can observe about other people are their behaviors? So for any of us, it would be hard for us to have any type of objective view. And that's why the psychometric measurement can provide a significant level of insight beyond what we can otherwise naturally observe. This is also why the extremity of some scores are easy for us to underestimate, because for us, it's normal. We've only ever lived in the skin of ours. It is legitimately hard for us to know, no matter how objective we think we are, to understand how we compare others. And if we are very extreme, we're often surprised by that extremity. And when you do feedback, that's often part of that, but we normalize our own condition. The person who is, extremely competitive, for them it's normal. They've only ever lived in their skin. So they may say, yes, I recognize this characteristic, I feel it. I'm just surprised it's that high, or I'm surprised it's that low, whatever the factor may be. So we have a way of measuring 17 different characteristics. We gather them into subgroups. They're easy to organize, the relational aspects of affiliating and attracting. Some people really enjoy people. They enjoy relationships, and their expectations of relationships are different than people who get less energy in this space. There is the ideas, the cognitive aspects of that. There are aspects of the way we like to control our world. And there are things we like to defend and maintain. So the instrument measures all of these, and these are 17 variables that are independent of each other. It means when you look at combinations, you get a further level of finesse and specificity that you often don't get in other psychometric tools. And it's a real moment of discovery, because it's hard in the world that we live in, particularly perhaps at the moment with everything that's going on around us, because it gets pretty noisy out there, let's face it, to pull back from all of that. Forget what's going on. Forget all the noise and the distractions and the confusions and all of the emotional resonance that conjures up. Forget where I am. Forget how I got here. Fundamentally, what do I find personally rewarding, fulfilling, energizing today, not 20 years ago? Or have I ever stopped and asked the question? Let's understand that. Then let's look at how I'm developing myself. Or let's look at directional aspects, or where I'm taking my career, or what's next, or how I spend my personal space. It's a very good way of checking in what's in it for us. There are aspects of this which just keep showing up in organizations. The relational aspect, it doesn't matter what function you're in, what industry, what level of seniority or otherwise, relational aspects are always going to be there. It's a constant. And bias, as you may imagine, can significantly influence these types of dynamics. So the way we interact, our expectations of people, our support needs, our informational needs, all of these things contain potential areas of bias. And I'm going to now share a few particular examples. These are only a few of them. It's not exhaustive, but we've chosen the ones that we feel may be good examples of them. So the mindset bias, we walk in the room and we have certain ways of thinking. If I'm highly competitive, for example, I may have the oppositional mindset, the you versus me mentality, and I might walk in the room and not even know I'm doing it. And someone who does not have that characteristic might not even occur to them. Now, that doesn't make the other person better than me. It doesn't make them worse than me. It just makes them different than me. And that's part of the philosophy of this particular psychometric assessment. And in fact, is woven into the skin of MRG, which is this is a descriptive approach, not evaluative. People are just different. People are kind of unique, and that's okay. There's very little right or wrong about these things. But we do walk in the room with mindsets and assumptions and expectations and ways of estimating things. And we don't even know we're doing it because that's all we've ever done. Interpretive biases, again, the competitive person may see everything as a competition. The traffic light goes green. Suddenly it's Formula One, that instinctive pull to get away first. The person who likes being persistent, they like tenacity, they like significant challenges, but they may interpret giving up as an admission of defeat. And you know as well as I do that in life, there is a time to course correct, or there's a time to walk away and let go. And it's harder to do if this characteristic sits because of the interpretive bias. That equals an admission of defeat. And I do not do that. That is my badge of honor. Assumptions. Some people are cautious interpersonally. They may assume that people have agendas or hidden agendas. It makes it more likely, consequently, that they may over or misinterpret others. Some people assume that facts speak for themselves. Those people who have a rational orientation, they tend to be very evidence-based. There are a few other, the estimation error. If I'm someone who doesn't need a great deal of support, it increases the likelihood that I might underestimate other people's need. I might underestimate the fact, and I might underestimate the emotional consequence on other people, because I might not even be pointed in that general direction. You'll notice I'm saying might. It doesn't necessarily follow. We can't make assumptions about people. We have to stop and ask ourselves the question, and to do so in an evidence-based way. And Trisha's at the end of this going to talk about some of the ways of dealing with bias that provides perhaps an element of insight and objectivity so that we know what to do with some of these things. The attribution error, we talked about fundamental attribution. Sometimes we ascribe intention to other people. What they said is this, but what they really meant is that. I defy anyone to tell me we haven't done that once in a while at least. And are we always right? Are there times when we got the wrong end of the stick, we read too much into, and the imagination takes over that conversation in our mind? It can happen. These are examples of bias. These are very tangible ones. I'm going to give you a few others. So some people really enjoy helping other people. They get a great deal of energy when they are doing things that are in service of the needs of others. And there's lots of advantages to all of that, but it might entail a bias. It increases the probability that a bias might occur depending on the degree of magnitude that you are drawn towards and get energy from this particular area of the world. So those who are motivated to give may have the assumption bias that everyone wants my help or that people value my support. And where is that written? That assumption has no basis in fact. And if you want to talk about facts, here's a good one. The motivation to achieve and to succeed. Some people are very motivated for bigger, for better, for more. I get there, ooh, that's great, but now I want this. This is an example of the mindset bias. You get there, it's not good enough, now I want that. And you get there and that's not good enough, now I want something else. It's never good enough. Never happy where I am because it's not where I want to be. But even if I get there, it's not good enough. When does it ever end? And are there times when we may have other consequent mindset biases, the so what mindset? I achieved something, yes, so what? The quick and easy dismissal of achievement where other people may want to celebrate that. I could give you another example of this in the same area, achieving and succeeding, an assumption bias. These people may assume, for no reason, that other people are as motivated as they are. Again, that assumption has no basis in the facts. All of us, at some point, it's helpful to stop and reflect on our own characteristics. The objective measurement can help in all of that, but it also helps us to look around the room, not through our own assumptions and mindsets and estimations, but in a more complete and a more objective way. And on that basis, to think about better behavioral choices, but now they are choices. Some people love their autonomy. They like being self-reliant, self-sufficient. Interpretive bias. They may interpret support from others as interference. So we talked about the high-giving people really enjoying helping them, but they may assume that other people want their support. Those people who want autonomy will interpret that very support as interference or a form of control. So you think you're helping them, but you only think you're helping them. What you are in fact doing is interfering with them as it feels to them. Kind of proves what they say about the road to hell and good intentions, does it not? And some people do value external recognition. They like feeling validated. I like the way you did that. But if we have less energy for this, if it's not a big deal for us, it doesn't matter if we don't care. It doesn't mean we don't care what people think about us. It just doesn't have a huge motivational consequence. We get less energy for it, but we might underestimate other people's need for validation and recognition. We might underestimate the emotional price that they may suffer if they don't feel validated, if they don't feel appreciated. And to wrap up my section, we talked earlier in some of the slides about the proportions and the numbers around the degrees of collaboration and interaction. Interpersonal dynamics is the thing that will always be there. And here's a few examples of where you can be really, really specific, which again is a characteristic of the tool. There is a significant difference in having a degree of sensitivity to feeling unsupported. Some people, if they are high in the relevant driver, will be sensitive to feeling unsupported much more quickly than others. And those who are lower, of course, may have that estimation error. They will underestimate the fact that these people need more support because they don't. And they will underestimate what it will feel like for these people, the emotional price if they feel unsupported, and they may feel unsupported very quickly. But there's a big difference between feeling unsupported and feeling ignored. Now we're being specific. Now we can think about these things in much more particular terms. Equally, there's a big difference between feeling unsupported, ignored, and feeling unappreciated. You know, ignored versus unappreciated. You know, I don't care what you think about me. Some people need recognition. I need you to notice me. They want attention, not recognition. And equally, some people are very sensitive to feeling excluded, which again is different than feeling unsupported. It's different than feeling ignored. It's different than feeling unappreciated. It's important to understand the unique sensitivities that any of us have. It may consequently be important to understand that what matters for us may not apply to other people. So there's some legitimate questions here that are worth asking. What are my unique sensitivities and what bias may they give rise to? If I have less sensitivities in these areas, does it increase the likelihood or probability that I may underestimate other people's needs? If I do have sensitivities in this area, for example, I appreciate recognition, do I assume that other people do as well, just because I do? Again, that assumption has no basis in fact. The more, as leaders or as citizens of an organization, we enhance our ability to look around the room, again, in an objective, in a complete way, not through our own filters, it increases the likelihood that we will make wise behavioral choices. We will calibrate the way that we inform, the way that we support others on their terms, not on our terms. So, any thoughts, questions on that before I hand it back to Tricia?
Thanks, David. Yes, folks, feel free to put anything else in that you have as a question, but a few have come up. One is thinking as a coach, what are the questions that you can ask clients to start to test these biases and help tease them out and raise awarenesses of what some of these biases might be?
There's lots of answers to that, and of course it will partly be contingent on which particular biases you want to explore. So I'm going to give you one specific example for the purpose of being relatively brief. when it comes to someone's informational needs. All of us have informational needs. We've talked about interpersonal sensitivities. That's another example. But we all, in order to feel informed, some people would say, I just need to know stuff. We often haven't drilled down to a level of specificity. So you ask a series of questions in the coaching context. Number one, what are my informational needs, or what are my interpersonal sensitivities? And get people to reflect on that. They can observe themselves, or we can measure psychometrically. Number two, have you informed other people of those needs, be they informational or interpersonal, so that they can support you on their terms? Number three, do you have the vaguest idea what other people's needs are, recognizing they may be very different than yours? And the fourth and vexatious question is, how do you know? Are you guessing? Are you making up as you go along? Have you asked them? Have you observed something specific that informs your view? It's a reasonable question. There's lots of methods of getting to all of this, but having a psychometric measurement can initiate that dialogue and give empirical and measurement-based view, which can really make an important contribution.
Thanks. We have several great questions coming in, and please continue to put them in. I will hand things off to Tricia so we can move to the end of the presentation, but we should have another minute or two at the end, and of course we'll follow up on any that we can't get to. So do please continue to submit those as we go, and I will hand things back to Tricia.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, David. All right, so we promised we wouldn't leave you hanging. How to deal with biases. So remember, biases thrive in our reactive, non-reflective mind, right? They thrive in that automatic space. So I'm going to give you some very specific things, but there are 4 different categories of strategies to mitigate these biases. The first is, and what David has just taken us through, is know yourself, right? The more one is self-aware, the more one can self-regulate, the more one can self-reflect. The second is related to reflection, right? Taking the time to reflect back on your patterns, to reflect on where your feelings and reactions are coming from, that metacognition. The third is slow down, because remember, we have 2 parts of our brain, thinking fast and thinking slow. So the automatic fast thinking is where the biases live. We mitigate them, we understand them, we reflect on them, we react to them more concretely and more consciously when we slow down. And finally, remember the example of driving in the car. Our habits live in that older part of our brain. They actually live predominantly in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. So again, our brain goes automatically to habits, but there are really helpful ways as it relates to bias to break that habitual cycle of reaction that is often bias-led. So let me just quickly give you some specifics under each of these. So first, increase your own awareness. So David just went through this, right? Becoming aware of your own motivations. Like, why do I do what I do? It's very interesting when we work with people in motivations. Initially, they talk about things as if they're universally good, right? Better to give than receive, right? It's a dog eat dog world. So everybody's got to be sort of on edge and competitive. And when you really understand yourself, you understand that the things that you held as universal are very personal and actually are a map to some of where your biases live. Also understand triggers, right? Remember we said the biases thrive in our reactive, non-reflective mind. And our reactive, non-reflective mind is running the show when we're triggered. So what are my internal triggers? When am I likely to be more in a situation where I am less grounded, less able to reflect, less able to pause and bring my more in-depth thinking online? Also know your external triggers, right? Some people hate meetings and know you're going to be on edge, and that reactive mind is more in charge. Some people really are challenged by how people express themselves in email. Sometimes it's just a particular person, right? You see them, you hear their voice, you see their name in your inbox, and something happens. For some of us, it's, we're less able to regulate and pause at certain times of the day, right? So know your own triggers, right? So know yourself. Create practices of reflection. These are just examples. There are many different ways people reflect in writing, people reflect in conversation, people reflect by just looking back at the day. So create patterns of reflection, because we can learn in hindsight, right? How much hindsight is 2020, right? I wish I had done that. If I had taken more time, if I had understood more, if I had given myself a night to sleep on it, right? We know how to make our decisions less reactive, less biased. So take some time for reflection. Sometimes it's helpful to look at when you have experienced bias, right? When somebody has directed their bias towards you. We get, you know, one of the hardest things I think for us to navigate is feeling misunderstood. So usually we are the victim of somebody else's bias. And then you can, it's easier, that's an easier pathway to go in and say, well, then how have others might have been influenced or impacted by my own biases directed towards them. Remember that this lives in our automatic fast brain, right? So part of it is just building slow down practices. And it is actually quite amazing how much the breath happens with this. And there's really good evidence that, assuming you're not super torqued and, you know, really in a high state of stress, but you're just going too quickly, you can feel your reactive brain kind of really revved up, that just taking 3 deep breaths can reset the brain. Sometimes we all know this, right? If it's a bigger issue, sometimes it's a longer slowdown can happen. But you want to be careful, right? Because remember, our brain believes what it hears, and it can be especially attentive to what it hears from our own narrative, right? So be careful that in the slow down space, you're not just reinforcing what your reactive brain thinks. Oh, gosh, I knew he was going to be like that. He's always like that. Of course, what else could I expect that he would react like that? Because that's just the kind of person he is. So if you fill the slow down space with a narrative that just reinforces the conclusion your reactive brain made, then it's not helping you. So you have to just be really attentive to the internal narrative. Learn to recognize how it feels different to you when you've made a thoughtful, considered response to something versus when you've had an automatic response. And part of that is just recognizing time and effort. If it came fast and it felt effortless, it's your automatic response. If it took a little bit more time and it took a little bit more effort to think it through, that's the prefrontal cortex, okay? The other thing is bias as it relates to people often comes because we have put too much weight on too small a piece of information. So if we can be disciplined enough to slow down and really want to discover more completely who other people are or who another person is, we have more data in the brain and we're less likely to make broad sweeping judgments with very small pieces of information. Breaking the habit cycle, our brain loves our habitual ways of thinking. It loves to keep churning the same thought cycles, the same thought patterns, the same belief structures over and over in our head. It is a great place to develop thinking partnerships with people that you respect, but think different than you do. So think different than you when you're problem solving and your biases can be influenced then. Think differently, have a different kind of relationship, or know somebody better that you're maybe having a challenge with. So invite that perspective of somebody that you value, but you know they think differently than you do, and it moves the brain out of that habitual cycle into the prefrontal cortex. Ask for feedback, you know, sit with people and say, my thought is going this way, or this is my reaction. Can you react to that for me? As soon as you ask questions, you engage the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex loves to engage around the how do I know this is true? What's a different way to think about this? The prefrontal cortex turns on with open-ended questions, right? So when we ask questions to open up the conversation and not leading questions like, how could you believe anything other than this is the truth? But really open-ended questions. What are different perspectives? What data are we missing? Are we making this decision too quickly? And if so, how do we slow it down? Now, here's a little brain hack for you. our brain is more likely to go to the fast, automatic, threat-sensitive mechanisms in our brain when we're thinking about a problem or an issue about us real time. That's when the brain gears most to what could go wrong, what could hurt you. So there are two tricks to help shift that around the same topic. How would you advise somebody else about this? For some reason, have you ever noticed this, how brilliant we are at giving other people advice versus giving ourselves advice? But the brain actually kicks into the prefrontal cortex because it's less threat sensitive when we're thinking about it in terms of somebody else. The brain also becomes less reactive and less threat sensitive if I'm thinking about it in the future, right? How might I handle this a year from now, right? If I was confronted with the same issue, the same problem, the same concern, the same opportunity, like how would I think through it a year from now, right? It moves the brain out of that thinking fast into the thinking slow mechanism. You know, I know Lucy's chuckling or rolling her eyes at me, but I love this quote. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. I think whether we're thinking about bias for ourselves or whether we're thinking about bias for our clients, really the work is understand some of the brain basics, understand how your own motivational dynamic actually influences very unique biases that are yours, your own, and spend time building a few strategies to move your automatic thinking fast brain into the thinking slow lane so that you can take advantage of kind of the amazing things that our prefrontal cortex can do. So look at us, Lucy.
Hey!
Screech right to the end.
Yes. Yeah, we don't have a ton of time. I do want to let people get to the next hour, but one quick question among many, and we will follow up on those we don't get to. People who are familiar with our LEA 360 know of blind spots that people see in their scores. Can you speak a little bit to whether the biases, the relationship of some of these biases you talked about to potentially causing those blind spots?
That's a great question. So I think there's a mix, right? And in some cases it can be biases, right? That I really, really care about people, and people remember that illusion of transparency. Maybe I'm not very expressive, but everybody knows how much I care, right? Because I'm a caring person. So the bias of illusion of transparency is even if I'm not very explicit with you, you already know. How can you not know that I don't care about you, right? So the illusion of transparency is a big one in the blind spots, right? That people can see, they know what my intentions are, they know who I am as a person, and of course, they're looking at everything I do and don't do through the lens of that knowing me so well, right? So that absolutely influences bias. But you know, being a leader is means interacting in a very complex matrix of who am I and how do I understand the world and how do I express myself in relationship to who are you and how do you understand yourself and how do you express yourself and how do you perceive how I'm expressing myself. So even if we could actually imagine a state where we are bias free, it doesn't exist, but if we could imagine it, then still the complexity of the filters we all pass our own and others' behaviors through will still give us blind spots even without the bias. So yes, bias influences, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Thanks. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up, but do pop any remaining questions right into the Q&A box there and we'll follow up with you afterwards. Just a reminder that the slides and recording and Q&A will be on the way to you via email. And we'll also send links to some of the resources that were described during the session. And we have plenty of things coming up. A brand new webinar at the beginning of November about shared leadership, something we're hearing a lot about lately, a workshop on using the IDI with teams. If you're already certified in the IDI, you may want to check that out. And then we have certification. So if you're not certified in some of the tools that we've talked about, we have many sessions, all online, of course, coming up as well. And registration for anything you see here is at mrg.com, right under the calendar tab. So we hope to see you again very soon. And With that, I will let everyone go. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks all.